Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Wherever you are from this continent or other continents. Welcome to today's presentation. It's a panel presentation by multiple psychologists and psychology trainees here. And our topic for today is Feminist and Foreign, International Psychologists' Lived Experience of Structural Barriers in the US. As we begin today, let's start with introductions. My name is Seema Jacob. I am an early childhood psychologist from Houston, Texas. And we have Dr. Mukamala. I would ask each one of you to go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob. Hello, everyone. My name is Shruti Mukamala. I use she, her pronouns. I'm coming to you from Irvine in California. I am an early career psychologist, and I'm currently a senior staff psychologist, so mainly in a clinical and training role at the University of California, Irvine.
Dr. Young.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Young. I'm a licensed psychologist based in Washington, D.C. I'm currently working in private practice and also a consulting psychologist with a nonprofit international organization. I'm considered a mid-career psychologist, and most of my work right now is centered around working with international aid, humanitarian aid workers, as well as folks who identify as third culture kids and global nomads.
Thank you. Ms. Shah.
Took me a minute to register my own name, but my name is Tanvi. I'm a third-year doctoral student at Boston University currently, originally from India, so still working through the academic process as a student and a trainee.
Thank you. Dr. Irani.
My name is Dr. Tarunesh Irani. I am in Buffalo, New York. I work at SUNY Buff State College in the Counseling Center as a senior counselor. I work with young adults, and that's it.
Dr. Choi.
Hi everyone, I'm Yuri Choi. I'm a senior staff psychologist at the University of California, Irvine Counseling Center. And I originally come from South Korea. I'm an early career psychologist. And another role at the University of California, Irvine is I'm an eating disorder coordinator.
Dr. Kim.
Hi everyone, my name is Grace Kim. I'm a clinical associate professor in the counseling psychology and applied human development department at Boston University. I work with Tanvi. I'm a mid-career psychologist whose research focuses on social justice education and Asian American psychology.
Welcome. And Dr. Sugumaran. You would need to unmute yourself, Dr. Sugumaran. Sorry. Dr. Sugumaran, we still cannot hear you.
Is it better? Can you hear me now?
Perfect. Yes, yes.
Sorry about that. So I tested my headphones. I think there was an issue. Hi, everyone. I am Niyati Sukumaran. I am a licensed psychologist in California. I'm currently in San Diego. I came to the US as an international student, worked at multiple university counseling center settings with international students and Asian American community. And I continue to do that in my private practice as well. So thank you for being here and listening.
Thank you. And finally, we have Dr. Diaz.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Diaz. I am a licensed psychologist and the director at UC Irvine Counseling Center. I have the wonderful pleasure of working with a couple of your panelists today. And so I'm really excited to be here and excited for this topic, which is incredibly important.
thank you to all of you, each one of you, for being here and being part of this panelist. So we'll kickstart off with our presentation, and I want to start off with one of the quotes by a modern Nigerian poet, Ijoma Omebenyo. I could have butchered her name, but apologies. So here you are, too foreign for home, too foreign for here, never enough for both. So as we think about this quote, I want to ask each one of our panelists to talk about themselves, about their stories and identities. I can start with myself. Born and raised as the youngest female twin in a Christian family in Mumbai, India, I grew up with family values of educational achievement and success, practice of Christianity, respect and honor for elders, loyalty to family first, and servitude to our community. Arriving into the US in 2007 as a young adult on a student visa, and then progressing to working in this country on a work visa, while waiting in this long line of a decade or more to gain permanency in this country. My identity as a Christian, as a daughter, as a sister, as a Mumbaiite Indian from an upper middle class female, from an upper middle class family and a female, transformed to include multiple aspects. Right now, it is being an aunt, a sister-in-law, a woman of color, a minority, an immigrant, a legal alien, a multilingual clinician, an early childhood psychologist, an infant mental health specialist, a friend, a faculty, a supervisor, and many more. I'm going to ask Dr. Mukamala to
So a lot of what you said, Seema, definitely resonates with me in terms of the identities, the route to coming here as an international student, right? And I think what's most salient to me in terms of my identities right now is immigrant, definitely, right? So part of that same long queue that you're talking about, and really wondering what all of those years of education mean when education and educational achievement is definitely a value. But then there's also this process of what that means to others in terms of my identity within the US. The other identity that's really important to me is an Asian American woman in the United States. So that process of being racialized into the United States, I think, has been a huge part of my professional identity, as well as now as someone who's raising an Asian American child in the US, a South Asian American child in the US. Really, that racialized identity seems to be at the top for me. I think the other interesting thing that I'm currently going through right now is due to COVID, just really thinking a lot about kind of passports and what they mean, and how kind of power gets translated with this piece of paper, when especially in the US, none of us are here on land that is, that's our land, right? Like it's actually someone else's land. So really thinking a lot about like settler colonialism and what that means coming from a country that was also colonized. So these are some of the things that I'm thinking about as we talk and chat.
Dr. Young?
Thanks. So I do want to mention that my given Chinese name is Yang Tianluo, and I've never shared that in a public space before. And I thought about sharing it because I'm considered a 1.5 generation Chinese Taiwanese American. The Chinese Taiwanese part is a whole other conversation. But, I was born in Taipei, Taiwan, and I immigrated to the US when I was 2. So for all intents and purposes, I've always considered myself American. I didn't know what life was like in Taiwan, but I was never Chinese enough, not even for my own family. They always called me the American one, and of course in America, when my name wasn't Jennifer, it was Tianluo. I was not American enough. And so there was that kind of, that quote that you mentioned, Dr. Jacob, earlier, fits perfectly with many of us, which is not Chinese enough for there, not American enough for here. And my path is a little bit different or unusual because most of my working and living and studying experiences outside of the US came to me as an adult. So there's that part of my identity that's a little bit more complicated too. So anyway, my here today is as a role of an ally, and so I'll keep it brief and just stop there. Thanks.
Misha?
So I think a lot of what has been said also is true for me. But as context, I moved to the US much more recently. I moved here in 2017. So what it has meant for my identities has evolved over the years. In India, I already had a master's. I had worked as an individual therapist for 5 years before I decided to move here. So I was much older. But identities that I feel have been central to my work in India was I was an upper middle class woman, but gender played a very central role in how I walk through life. I also come from a family that has given emphasis to academics over the years. So having a grandmother who had finished high school was really rare in that context. So, and also having a grandfather who had a PhD, and academics in general has been centered. So I do actually resonate with that idea of I'm in academics, but what does it really mean? Because academics is what brought me to the US. And while there are several identities that I continue to navigate, I think what is most present in the academic realm is that I'm South Asian. I don't identify as Asian American. I do identify as Asian, and that's the racialized experience of being here for as long as I have now. I identify as queer. I'm an international student, which definitely changes some aspects of my experience here, and a woman of color. And that's an identity that I continue to explore what it means for me as someone who's new here versus people who might have had to grapple with that identity for generations. So to kind of unpack that, and also kind of echoing coming from a colonized land, I had a British nun as a principal for my school, to now coming here where colonization looks a whole different, has a whole different kaleidoscopic metaphor. Like in my head, it's just like it's the same thing, but it's different, and then that's something I'm kind of trying to unpack. But currently a doctoral student, the journey that I came here on was it's funny because I actually think my master's in India was significantly better than my master's in the US, and I don't say that out loud too much, but I wanted to get a particular job, and I was told that my master's degree wouldn't be enough. So I applied for a doctoral program, didn't get in, did a master's program in the US. Interestingly, not much changed in 2 years, but somehow after a master's in the US, I got into a doctoral program. So that's also an interesting journey in thinking about what's given value. But I will stop there, but that's in short where I'm at right now.
Thank you, Misha. Dr. Choi?
Thank you. I can resonate with so many things that you already have shared. I think, a part of me is I come to the US as a full adult. So I, born and raised in South Korea, and again, my bachelor's and master's degree, and I worked there 6 years as a researcher therapist. So I already had my own life, over there. And then I have prepared, but because of my own a curiosity about the world, and I had desire to live in the multicultural society that I can see I'm not limited with only monolingual or monocultural society. So I was so excited to come into the US to learning that, and also study counseling psychology. But when I come to the US, I realized I didn't think about the factor, what that means living in the society as a minority. So that was a whole shift, and making me to realize, about when I'm dreaming about living in a multicultural society, is not actually the reality. So that's just having a lot of meaning for me. So I have been working a lot with the minority students, especially international students, but also other students of color, LGBTQ students, and so many other layers of minority status. I can resonate with them a lot, and then I have been working on together. But I still figured out that I see myself as a minority here, still as an international person who need to go through this still visa process, immigration process. So it feels like even like a long time ago, I have been here and then, having changed the status, but still there's a long way to go to fight for myself and for the other people. So that's where I am as of now. I hesitate to myself to identify as an Asian American yet, because I don't feel like American, the paper-wise, and that's so much meaning of my work and other career and the trajectory. So I'm thinking about like how many people in the US have been in this lingering process and like a limbo and cannot decide their career because of all of those identities. So that's where I am at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Choi. Dr. Irani?
Most of the things that you all have said resonates with me. I was born and raised in India. I come from a Zoroastrian family that many people do not know about. It's a very small religion, a small community, which originated in Iran and migrated to India. So we are a minority in India, and pretty much our religion is becoming extinct. Which makes it, including with the religion, it's also being the female in my house, because I was the youngest of three. I was being groomed to only marry. And so I had to voice my way through a lot of family members, predominantly males, to voice that I needed education. So eventually I did, and I became the first generation female member in my family to do a doctoral degree overseas. And my identity constantly depends on which world I am part of. And that's a learning curve, because it's like the complexities of the identities change with the socio-political climate. What is most important at that time. However, I've often noticed that my identities, which identity takes priority depends on which world I am in. So if I'm in India, it's the religion, and being a female, that becomes a challenge, or it has strengths. But being here, I had to shift to to identify myself as a South Asian Indian, versus calling myself an Indian, because that causes a lot of confusion to a lot of people. And oftentimes there is also this thing is, because I have different features, I oftentimes am put in different boxes because of the fact that many people do not know what my background is. Even my last name or my first name throws people off. Given my personal and professional experiences, I feel these identities are ever evolving, and they bring with them set of challenges, but also strengths, because it has led to a journey of becoming aware of how strong you are, and how you can advocate for others that you can pave the way.
Dr. Kim?
I am just so loving this conversation and getting to know all of you. So I was born and raised in Seoul, Korea, and then I was a reluctant immigrant to the US when, as a teenager, when my mother decided that she wanted to pursue her doctorate degree. So it was such a feminist kind of action within the family. So she came by herself initially, and she was working on dissertation, and she was just so lonely, and she really wanted to have the family come over. So that's how I ended up here. And then soon after that, a couple of years later, she was finished with her work, and then she wanted to return. So I am technically in this sort of generation of parachute kid. So kind of a complex immigration history. That's what I hold. At this point, I've been in the US almost twice or even more longer than I was in Korea. So my identity has really shifted to being Korean American, Asian American, person of color, and thinking a lot about allyship and advocacy for other racial minority groups as well. But in that process, I had to think a lot about belongingness as to like, do I belong here or there in Korea, and then or neither, and kind of coming to a space of feeling like, you know, belonging is something that I claim, and that where I am and where my people, you know, are is where I belong. So I'm kind of making that transition in terms of my thinking. So kind of, you know, creating my own belonging. I think some of the current things that I'm grappling with is because my, you know, extended family is continuing to be living in Korea. Now we are more of a transnational family. So as my parents are getting older, kind of thinking about caretaking and all of those things internationally and across the oceans, what that looks like. So there's new kind of issues that I'm grappling with, which I haven't thought about before. So, but I'm here as an ally. So I'll pause right there.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Dr. Sugumaran?
Hi, can you all hear me right now? Okay, great. So I, like many of you have shared, I came to the US as an international student in 2008. I frequently reminded myself at that time of how I chose to come to this country. And 10 years later, I realized that even though I chose to come here, it didn't take away from the hardship that I experienced when I came here. I was going to be an engineer, and I sort of changed tracks completely, and I decided to pursue psychology. So my parents were upset and not sure. They were very concerned about what I was going to do with my career. You know, and in my immediate family, I'm the first. Actually, I'm a first generation. I got my graduate degree and then my PhD. And that too was a very discovering process, just like what Tanvi shared. I came here trying to figure out, should I do my PhD or no? But then I decided to do my master's because of the financial commitment. And then realized for what I wanted to do, I needed higher education. And it was a very interesting journey to sort of explore that part of my identity. And lo and behold, I met my partner, my husband, and it was very interesting because I worked after my graduate degree. So I experienced the hardships of not finding jobs while interviewing for multiple positions. It would get blocked off at the HR process for some reason. And then I had to sort of, it led me to think that it was my OPT status, the optional practicum training status, that was coming in the way. And their perspective of if I would be eligible to be hired for future employment. So I pursued my PhD, and I got married, and I'll talk more about that later on. But there was a shift in status, my immigration status at some point, closer to internship, and just reflecting on the privileges that come with a shift in status has been interesting, and what it means to me, really questioning, am I Indian enough right now? But I don't identify as am I Indian American? It's been a very interesting self-reflective process. So I empathize with a lot of my colleagues here. And I'll pause at that.
Thank you, Dr. Sugumaran. Dr. Diaz?
Thank you. I'll be brief. Part of why I'm here is actually because I'm here as an ally, and why this topic is so important to me is, as a daughter of an immigrant, I've heard many of the stories that have already been shared today. I remember as a young child asking my father, who immigrated from Cuba, if he missed home, and he said the idea of home is such an interesting concept. because they no longer accept me because of some of the political things that were happening there and how he was seen as someone who had left the country. And here his English wasn't strong enough. And so he was constantly put in positions that were really challenging for him, and his degrees didn't matter here. So he had to sort of start all over again. And so trying to find where home really was for him, it really became about creating a home within our internal environment. And so recognizing the privileges that I had, having been born here, I use those privileges in the ways that I can to raise the voice and try and support our international employees and students. As a former training director for 8 years, I would constantly talk with supervisors who would come to me about concerns around language, which I know is something we're going to talk about in a little bit, and how they wanted to know, should I be writing up this person's grammar? And I was like, no, we're talking about the clinical skills and, what are we emphasizing? And so I really feel that it's important for me to recognize the privileges that I have, and that even though I'm a woman of color in a leadership role, and hold those different identities, and there's complexities around that, I do have privileges. And so wanting to use those leadership positions that I have to advocate in spaces, because the risks to me are very different than the risks to our international students, staff, and faculty. And so I recognize that. And so I'm so grateful to be a part of this panel and so grateful to hear all of your stories.
Thank you, Dr. Diaz. And I agree, it's a very rich experience and space to be even right now, as I'm hearing glimpses of each one of your stories around, either you came into this country without a choice as an adult or as a child, or you choose to come into the US and create a personal and professional life here. And then navigating each of your own spaces, each of your, journeys, whether it is relevant to being an immigrant or, or whether it is recognizing, like, what is my land? Where is my home? It's not my land, but this is not enough for me. Do I belong here? Very existential sort of existential questions of life, of who I am and where do I belong? How do I now have to shed certain parts of me that I knew was so relevant and significant, and I have to sort of morph and evolve into something else that I never even anticipated. So as we continue sort of listening to, each other's sort of journey of growth, of transformation, let's switch into talking a little bit more about strengths, supports, challenges, and possibly even some structural barriers as we have navigated the space of being in this country. So let's start with Dr. Mukamala. If you could speak a little to this topic.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think the one thing I will say, though, that was resonating with me is a few of us kind of wanted to come to the US because it was difficult to find what felt like a fit professionally in places that maybe we were at, right? So it was just searching for that professional meaning, identity within family. And it's so interesting that for me, at least, now that I'm here and I have that PhD, which I actually always wanted, right? I wanted to have a PhD. I wanted to be a doctor in some sense. And I am the first in my family, the first woman to get that. It still feels like it's difficult to find employment that's given your skills and your interests. And I think the reason I think that is because employment, especially, which is in a non-academic field. So it might be within academia, but in a non-academic field. So I'll talk about my experience at counseling centers. The experience of kind of sponsorship and visas is so specific to faculty roles that people who are in other roles have the same, distinctions, have the same kind of qualifications. It's really hard to even be able to bring up that process of employment or sponsorship with an employer, right? For me, the difficulty also because immigration is such a personally, strongly held belief that a lot of people have, that even bringing it up during the process of an interview feels hard because you don't know what personal biases you might be hitting up against. So when Niyati talked about the fact that, like, I don't know how that is going to be perceived. How do I bring it up? And yet kind of constantly needing to out myself at different levels, and then to constantly be saying, hire me. I know this is a process that you will have to go through in hiring me, and it's going to be hard, but these are the skills I bring. So constantly needing to kind of prove myself at different levels, even though I've seen colleagues who are at a similar level kind of just have that ease of movement in between all of the different roles that they want to embody, at least professionally. So I think that's something that I am grappling with, the personal kind of who is hiring, what might their personal beliefs be? What area am I in? Like, I currently live in a conservative part of the country, right? So immigration here means something very different than in Boston, where I lived and got my degree. So really that idea of knowing where I'm at, being very aware of my place, and needing to constantly then think about, how am I going to be perceived? Will this be the space? Will I get a chance here? That doesn't seem to have changed whether I'm in India or here. But here the barriers seem to be very specifically around my ability to work and what that means for the person who's hiring me.
Thank you, Dr. Mokamla. Dr. Sugumaran?
Yeah, I really relate to Shruti's experience in so many ways. And I remember going through all of that after my master's degree, and it was a very interesting shift for me once I got my postdoc, because my immigration status changed. I became, I was naturalized here as a citizen here, and so looking for employment after postdoc was an interesting process. I too was at a counseling center, and I felt like I had to out myself in a very unique way, where I had to justify, but my immigration status is okay now. I'm hireable. It's a very interesting place to be in, almost having to sort of justify that I have my degree, I have my clinical experience, I'm worthy, and this is not a barrier for me. That didn't sit well, I will be honest, it didn't sit well with me, because in some ways I felt like I was in a position of having to sort of explain, this is now my earned privilege, right? And there was this experience of, I've earned this because, it came along through being married, to someone. And, it's just personally, professionally, I felt like there was a lot of conflict. I also want to share, in terms of the privilege that came with that, is I'm a mom to an almost 2-year-old now, and motherhood really changed things for me and made me question, what do I want to do in my life? And because immigration is not an issue at this point, I was able to shift. I was able to move jobs, to find a job where there's a little bit more flexibility. And that is such an earned privilege that I sit with. And, I know for some of my colleagues, that's something that at this point, they can't afford that shift. So I just wanted to shed light onto that issue. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sugumaran. Very important, right? Like employment-based, you're so dependent after you move from being a student to then being hired and working and living a life, you're so dependent on your employer and what that means, and how much do you share that personal part of your story to people where the job doesn't require, like your immigration status, the job that requires you to do is your degree, your training, and your clinical work, your skills. Mm-hmm. I also want to invite Dr. Irani to highlight some of the strengths and supports and challenges or barriers that she's encountered in her journey, and maybe speak to some other aspects.
I think when I'm listening to you, what the conversation is, it's talking about the professional stage. What I wanted to throw light more is on the education stage. before even going to the professional stage, there have been a lot of challenges, supports also, and successes in terms of the progress of getting your doctoral degree here. Some of the supports I noticed is personal supports. If put in place, it's awesome. So say, for instance, my program did a good job of connecting me to a big SIB. I was able to have advisors and faculty members that had a good understanding of international students to advocate for me. I had a good cohort of students or students with international backgrounds that understood where I came from. So it was not an isolating experience, but I can see how isolating it can be if you do not have those supports. There are things that I noticed is that, programs do a great job in enrolling students, and the initial enroll and onboarding is great. However, the process, the journey continues, yet the support is not something that is continuously improved on. So say, for instance, initially coming, I remember when I was onboarded, definitely I was acclimated to the culture, things like that. However, it would be great if I was acclimated to the education system. Like sitting in a class and being told this is a quota system, I'm looking at others and saying, what's a quota system? I don't know what a quota system is. So again, or how the grading is, or even in terms of what's the focus is the focus on language versus content. Because again, we come with different skill sets. So I come from a British system. I knew English from a British system. Switching it to technical American system is way different, and struggling with that and writing, which would also impede a lot of things in terms of growth. So I found that, some programs do a great job in providing some supports, but then there are other areas. If everybody was able to make immigration their business and be able to educate themselves, it could be easier for students to get the support and the space where they can grow and become their full of potentials. Even in terms of systemic wise, immigration rules keep changing. So programs not knowing when we are in practicum sites, whether we can do a practicum or not, is many people are unaware of that. What are the roadblocks with regards to that? Or when we are doing an internship, what does that look like? How many days before your internship program you should be ending? Those are things that we don't know as students, and programs sometimes are also unaware of, and even internship sites are unaware of. So those are the challenges I noticed because it resulted in limited opportunities. It resulted in not being able to go to settings where only US citizens were allowed, and not being able to explore which specialty I could be, I'm not explored yet. But I definitely feel, the other things that I noticed were that acculturation, stress, and assimilation doesn't end with education. It continues. It's ongoing with your identities. It keeps changing, keeps evolving, getting different challenges into place. Systemic support is something that is always wavering depending on which stage you are. So say, for example, professional settings. I know, as you all rightly said, some settings don't even know what is immigration process like. And they get scared and they don't want to deal with it, which means we have limited opportunities and limited chances of even exploring a job where we may be a well fit. And the hardships with which that come, the hardships in terms of each stage that brings. Definitely, I can say the success has been is, I know each one in on this panel is resilient, has fought their own battle, and has become stronger at the end of the day. We have learned to advocate for ourselves. We have been proactive. There are other things that we bring to the table. However, it also could be great if we had more voices that could also support us.
Thank you, Dr. Irani. Ms. Shah.
I feel it's good following Dr. Irani because there are pieces as a current student that I'm constantly aware of. I think one of the pieces that I've had to own in this journey between having now lived in 3 different continents is there's also a certain amount of self that is added to the mix, that who am I when I walk into the room, and then the context is in, and I'm interacting with the context. So specifically when I think about arriving in the US, one of the strengths, and the reason I mention it is, I know a lot of students of color will walk into academia questioning whether they belong. But however, coming from a family which has had a long legacy of being in academics, that's never a question I've had to ask myself. It's when I arrived, I knew that I was good at academics. I knew that this was a space that I was allowed to occupy. And that's something that I have to be aware of when I'm thinking of myself as a therapist working with students of color, or working with colleagues who might have had a very different history. So that for me is a strength. And I think that that comes with privileges that I've held it back in my Indian self too. And the reason I mentioned that is, having had the education and had access to that education, I already was able to do a certain amount of identity exploration, especially since I had to be really aware of my caste. I also come from a minority religion in India. I have a specific gender. So those are all pieces that I'd spend a lot of time thinking about. So when I walked in here and people called me a person of color, I didn't know what that meant, but it meant that I needed to pause and unpack what that would mean for me. So it was a new label, but I knew the process of working with that. What that meant is then now I was interacting with that structure as a student. So when I think specifically now, when you think about structural barriers, I was applying to doctoral programs, I realized that there was such few professors I could apply to in locations that I wanted to work in, who did the work that I wanted to do. Like, that's so specific, right? That I'm looking for an Asian American professor, hopefully doing work in trauma, identity development, and Asian identities. And so that's a structural barrier. Who can I really work with? Even in the BU system, having to actively seek out grace, but also knowing that Dr. Kim is the only person in that faculty who's Asian American, like that's her journey, but also then saying that's the only person I want to work with, and actively having to advocate for that. And knowing that I would be her first doctoral student. And I said, I don't care, I just really want to work with someone who I can identify with at some level. Visa is constantly a struggle. No one in the department has necessarily had to interact to the extent that I have to grapple with as an Indian student. Another student in the program is a British student. So again, when you think about how a piece of paper can have different kind of access and what that means for practicum, what that means for internship, I can't do a summer practicum because I'm not enrolled in the summer system. So if you're not in a semester, you can't do internship for the CPT. It's constantly a back and forth. And then for the last 2 years as an instructor for multicultural counseling, that's a whole different conversation, but having to justify to the class that I'm allowed to teach this course. And you know, as this is a progress, like this is, all these identities are works in progress for me, I can still have a conversation with you around your identity development. So I think that for me, it's always an interaction of the self and the context. So that's where I'm going to pause.
Thank you, Misha. I think both you and Dr. Rani brought up also this important piece around access, right? Who are you connected to? Who is your sort of ally? Who is in your space? Who can advocate for you or guide you, or at least bring some of these issues into the forefront? And then access to support, like peers, colleagues, seniors, people in the community who can really guide as you step into this country, learn about this country, learn how to live a life in this new space with new rules and regulations, but also, you know, acculturate to being in the United States and being in a new academic environment. So thinking about access, our next overarching topic is around recommendations or suggestions for change. And out here, I also want to, you know, give an opportunity to people present here as allies to talk. So let's start with Dr. Mukamala talking about suggestions and recommendations for change.
I'll just be very brief here. The one thing I wanted to give a shout out to is non-international focused organizations. So I'll just say this entire panel came out of a support space that Division 35, Section 5 organized when there was a rule change around international students last year. So we had a support space which then grew into this panel, which then has now grown into a support system, right, which I'm hoping will continue to grow. We have an international task force in Section 5, right? So it really takes allies, and Grace was, the one who sent out that email and was thinking. So we need people in different spaces who don't embody that identity to say, hey, let's do this, and let's do this as part of this org, even though it's not specifically international. All are welcome here. The second piece I will say is it does take in employment specifically, just thinking about relative privilege and right. So I think all of us are aware of the relative privileges we have come in with. But really thinking about people who want to fight the system when the system says no, right? And having the power, but then also having the energy to fight the system, because there are so many battles that they're fighting. So I'm hoping that some of the allies we have here or the co-conspirators we have here will be able to speak to that piece as well. But just a shout out to non-international focused orgs kind of thinking of international people.
Thank you, Dr. Mukamala. I'm also realizing I skipped Dr. Choi in between. I know she was also going to talk about different countries and different perceptions. So I want to give her an opportunity to do that. And I apologize, Dr. Choi. I moved along and completely skipped you. So I apologize for that. But please take the floor.
Sure, no problem. Thank you. And I think, what I am thinking about my status as international is very different from someone who come from different cultural background or the countries too. So I want to just emphasize there is we have perception about international as a whole group, but also there's a diversity among us. So it's very important for us to think about what kind, how the person's journey can be different, the challenges or the support might look different based on their diversity. For example, for me, the language has been, very interesting and the key role, in my adjustment and, proving I'm good enough to be here. So I didn't use English in my daily life at all when I live in Korea. So when I come here, it's my first time I have to study with English and do the daily life with English. It has been very challenging. As I said, I was already full grown up. It's just very changing I think thought system. It had to be changed to talk in English. So it has been a lot. And I speak with accent. And then when there's a student who is, from the different countries, and then they have certain accent, they actually be treated differently. That's what I noticed. So when someone comes from European countries, then there's people often make a comment, oh, where are you from? That's so cool, you have that accent. So when I say it, I never heard about it. They only have, and like this, they just having emphasized I'm foreign, this is too different, and etc. So that's always have been in my mind, because as a counseling psychologist, you have to talk a lot. You have to meet a lot of new students too. So I have to always learn, is this person will accept me or really will understand me? Or there's things the person have frowning or having some questioning look, and then I have to explain myself. So there's a lot of barriers I have to prove I will be excellent in my clinical skill, so people cannot question about this. So that's one of the pieces that I'm noticing. The other part is, the become a minority in a different way is also coming from what kind of cultural background, what kind of identity you bring to the US. So if you're coming from the countries, you are maybe majority in the countries with your own skin color or your gender or in other ways. But when you're coming to the US, it can be totally different. Korea is a relatively homogeneous society. So I was never think about that I'm Asian or the Korean. I don't need to explore or explain what that means. I was just, being there. And when I come here, everyone asks where I'm from and what's culture like that. I feel like I'm the representative of the whole things about Korea. I have to explaining, and even Asia, a whole big continent, how diverse it is. But then some people don't know. They might the first one in their whole life meet the Asian Asian. Or some people even ask me about the North Korea, which I have no idea. So there is a lot of assumptions people made us about the internationals. And now when you are in the student's life and the step life, you feel you carry on the burden and responsibility. I am the representative in a way, like I have to be be right and be competent and doing well so that people will not question me. My employer will not regret to hire me and go through all this whole painful process, all the things. So I think that's constantly challenging as an international, but also as other panelists said, it gives me the opportunity really think about who I am and how I can develop myself who I want to be. So it has, comes with the strength, but also still it's being challenging.
Thank you, Dr. Choi. I think you bring up also a very important aspect about experiences and what we represent and the language or the accents we come from, and we bring to the table how that either impacts us or makes us feel more like exotic and more privileged, right? So who we are, where we come from, sort of definitely plays a big part in how we are perceived and what opportunities are given to us or what social sort of benefits we have. Because of what we bring to the table. But the other piece I think you really highlight, and I think which has been highlighted today, is the diversity of what it means to be international, what it means to be of Asian descent, and that we are not all belonging to the same bucket. Even though we're all international, we have such diverse identities, but also we all have such different facets of our being, and we're not a homogeneous lot. I want to ask Dr. Young to highlight about either recommendations for change from an ally's perspective.
Sure, thank you. So I think it's perfect for me to go after Dr. Choi because I need to first say that nothing I say today represents the opinion or stance of anyone I've ever worked for or currently work with. I worked in counseling centers. I worked with, like I mentioned, international nonprofits. I'm in private practice. And something that has struck me is everyone's story is very different, but the similarity when it comes to some of the hardships that are experienced. And this is for international folks working in other countries as well as inside of the US. And it kind of boils down to something that I call linguistic disempowerment. And it has to do with what Dr. Choi was talking about, the use of what linguists call globish. Globish is a term that refers to non-native English, and globish is an international English, and it comes with accents, all kinds of accents. And even though all accents are created equally, we're not treated equally, right? And so some of the international folks, whether they're professionals or they're students, when they come here and they have to not only learn how to speak English conversationally, which many of them already know how because they have to take a test in order to come here to study, and they're proficient in English. But as soon as they open their mouth, and if the accent is a not preferred accent, the immediate experience is feeling othered. And so that can come with microaggressions, which we've touched on today. It can also come with outright discrimination. And I'm shocked sometimes by the conversations I have with parents, faculty, international students, so on and so forth, where there's this common perception that international students specifically want to stick with their ethnic enclaves, and that they don't want to integrate, and that they lack critical thinking. They don't want to share their ideas in a classroom setting or in a workplace inside of a meeting. And I have to ask why. And when you explore why with some of these folks, and you learn about the challenges they face as soon as they open their mouth, that they get all this feedback, sometimes subtly and sometimes directly, that they are different, that they're other, and that there's perceptions that people have of them of being inferior somehow, because they speak with an accent, that they're somehow less competent or that they don't communicate correctly. But if you listen to the content of what they're saying, it's perfectly fine. It's just the accent, And so, you know, that is really unfortunate. I also think it's important for especially faculty members to think when students don't participate, because we have participation grades here in the US, some of the students, international students, come from countries where the pedagogy is completely different. In a work meeting or inside of a classroom, if you're asking a professor questions or you're asking your boss to repeat something or you're asking your boss a question, it's considered highly disrespectful. And so when they come to the United States, they have to kind of unlearn some of those things in order to participate in a way that's acceptable to US American culture. And so, you know, in terms of recommendations and suggestions, I really think that programming needs to happen. In workplace, maybe it means affinity groups. On a campus, it might mean having some type of ally program, you know, similar to those that help our veterans service members who are students, and educate our campus community of the multiple contexts that international students are carrying, are embodying when they're sitting in your classroom. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Dr. Diaz?
Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about just managing and working with the structural barriers that can exist as an employer. I will say that I've been at my current location for 12 years, and for the first 6 years, the idea of having any kind of sponsorship for an international employee was off the record. It just was not going to happen unless they were a faculty appointment, because we're in a clinical setting, it just doesn't occur. And my predecessor had tried for years with a constant no. And then when I became director, I thought, let's try again. And why not? And what I learned through the process was it was really important to educate myself. And the best place to get some of the education, unfortunately, fell on the employees themselves. I needed them to point me in the right direction so I could get the most accurate information, because there's so much misinformation in a university setting or an employer setting about what is and what isn't possible, as well as this perception of, well, if you sponsor someone, especially if you try and sponsor someone for permanent residency, then as soon as they get the residency, they're going to leave. Not understanding that the residency process could take years, like 5, 6, 10 years for a particular employee, which in and of itself is a longer employment than most of the current employment cycles that are occurring anyways. And so helping to re-educate the employer is really important. Financially, so there is a financial cost to sponsorship, whether it's at a visa level or a permanent residency process. And not every employment setting has the financial resources to do that. So I think part of being a good ally is being upfront and transparent, so that as individuals are looking for those places where they want to sort of work, they're clear about what they're committing to and what really is and what isn't feasible in that process, so that they can make informed decisions. The third thing that I would suggest is recognizing that the decisions that the employee wants to make around the visa sponsorship is a really personal one. And so I have learned there's so many different types of visas, which are very complicated. I will say that as opportunities have presented themselves, I've been really making it a point to speak directly with the employee to say, here's the options, here's the risks and the benefits of each. Which do you want to really pursue and try to have me advocate for? Because I recognize that what I may want for that individual, because it's easiest, may not be the one that's actually in the best interest of that particular employee. Recognizing that there's a time clock that they can't change. And so I need to be sensitive and aware of that. It is exhausting, this process, but I think it is so worth it. The value, what I like to say to my place of employment is, we can't recruit nationally, internationally, and bring all these individuals to come and study here and have a global environment, and yet then say, oh, but it stops at the student level. We can't, and then have our staff and faculty members. And as a former training director, I would say from the student intern side, recognizing the complexities, what I say is, if we want to attract really solid interns, it's helpful for them to have supervisors that they can have some shared identities around. And so I need to have people on my staff that can do that. So I would just really encourage those of you who maybe are feeling discouraged because we're battling so many other things, to get support from other directors or other employers who have been successful, learn from the things that have gone well for them, and also the things that haven't gone well, so that you can strategize around other pathways to get there. So I will say the last thing that I want to share here is I do feel like I've made some movement and had some success in my current environment, because I had an experience where there was a situation with an employee whose immigration status was changing, and the university suggested an option without me prompting it. Now, ultimately, the employee had to make their own choice about what worked for them. And recognizing that whatever that choice is can, if you have other international employees in your setting, it can create a ripple effect of anxiety, because not everybody knows all the information. And so as an employer, you want to be sensitive to that, create spaces of support, acknowledge, recognize, even within this most recent pandemic, recognizing that everybody was going to working at home or remotely. And I was in the background trying to figure out, what does that mean for my international staff? Are they allowed to? Does the visa allow this? Is there a change in this? And some of my colleagues not even recognizing that's a question that we should be asking. So, but I think it's incredibly valuable, and I've benefited greatly from having my international staff, as well as the students and our colleagues, because it really invites us to continue to grow and really think about what it means to be in a multicultural environment. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Diaz. And lastly, but not the least, Dr. Kim.
Thank you. I really echo what others have said here. And so I'd like to mention a number of different things. One is systemic issues, and Dr. Irani mentioned this earlier about how universities are actively recruiting international students, but once they get here, there's, really inadequate support system available, which is really kind of systemically problematic issue, where faculty, and as a faculty member, I think some of the recommendations for faculty is to be really proactively using our privilege and power to advocate for students and to be educated more. I'm going into my 15th year of teaching, and there has been zero education to faculty, through offices that work with international students. So what that often means that our information comes from students, international students themselves, who have to advocate for themselves and their colleagues. And that's also a really challenging thing, given power differentials and all of those other things happening too, right? So I think faculty need to be really kind of proactive in thinking about this issue, and letting, and having this communication with the administration. So last year, when there were all these, legal things happening, just kind of writing emails to deans about, we need to be really looking into this and so forth. I think those were some things that came up. The other piece is curricular issues, so if we look at curriculum, so much of it is US centric. And here's a question about, who are we privileging here, and academia is already very, very privileging white male experiences to begin with. And on top of that, there's a lot of just US focus, which can border on ethnocentrism as well, right? So how do we really kind of reflect on curricular choices that we're making to be global and to really, walk the talk? A lot of programs talk about talk about being global and globalizing and so forth, but I think it doesn't necessarily trickle down to curricular, pedagogical, that kind of choices that people are making. And then lastly, the piece that I want to talk about is just relationships, for faculty members to be connecting with students, and sort of having this conversation about what it's like to be studying in the US, and how one carries themselves in academia may look and feel very different based on cultural context, right? So I think there's that piece of conversation that can be had as well. So those are some things that I'm thinking about specifically for faculty.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Well, thank you for such a rich, discussion and sharing of your own personal journeys and your own, pieces of advice moving forward. As we come to the end of today's panel presentation, I also want to end with a quote from Milan Kundera. Being in a foreign country means walking a tightrope high above the ground without the net that is afforded to this person in a country where he has his family, colleagues, and friends, and where he can easily say what he has to say in a language he has known from childhood. So hoping as we walk this path in this country, we also recognize how do we create little strings for that net for the people who is walking this tightrope above the ground. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day or have a good evening and good night.